Okay, welcome back to the second part of the Guardian Legend based tier lists. Continuing on from the first one where we ranked the secondary weapons in the original Guardian Legend game from NES, this next tier is focusing on the fan-made game Shadow of Naju. And having played through that game recently, the overall experience is relatively fresh in my mind, which is why I wanted to do these videos now and not wait until I sort of forget. But like I mentioned in the first part, I'm going to rank the secondary weapons in the fan game, but I'm going to do it based on the max level you can obtain in the game. And on my other screen, what I've pulled up is a screenshot from my original playthrough of story mode, Shadow of Naju, and I'll try and find a way to put this on screen somewhere in the video. I may have to shrink down the image, or maybe I'll post it as an overlay or something. But basically, the way Shadow of Naju was laid out, and I've only played through the game once, and I'm pretty sure I got everything, was pretty thorough in trying to make sure I didn't miss any weapon upgrades or secrets. I'm gonna do this ranking based on the level of every secondary weapon when I beat the game, and I'm going to assume that it was the best possible level you could get. I could be wrong. If someone else who's more of an expert on the fan game knows the weapon max upgrades that are obtainable in the game, by all means let me know. But what I'm going to do is rank these based on where they all ended up in my playthrough. And it's pretty interesting because unlike the original Guardian Legend, for my Shadow of Naju playthrough, I didn't have everything maxed out. I had a bunch of level 2 weapons, a couple level 1 weapons, a couple level 3s, and one level 4, which is unique to that particular game, I believe. I don't think you can get level 4 weapons in the original Guardian Legend. But we'll go ahead and start with the ranking here. I will mention as I put these on the tier list where the upgrade level ended up on my playthrough. So we'll start with the bullet shield. And in my original playthrough, this secondary weapon was only level 1. It's possible I missed one shop upgrade where you can pay for an upgrade from the Lander shopkeeper, but this one ended up at level 1. And for Shadow of Naju, I'm going to put this one down at C tier. I didn't use a bullet shield at all in that playthrough. It would have been helpful in some sections, but I feel like its cost and overall effectiveness without it being max level was not really that compelling for the playthrough. And again, for this video, I'm not going to explain what these weapons do. I'll refer back to the first one for the original Guardian Legend, so if you are curious as to what the weapons do, please see the first video. We'll go ahead and move on. For the next one, the bullet shot. This one I didn't really use either, but a unique thing about this particular secondary weapon, and again, based on my playthrough, this was the only one in the game that hit level 4. The other weapons that I got didn't get higher than level 3, and it was only a couple of them. As a result, the bullet shot had very high damage output, so it came in handy against a couple of the corridor bosses, especially in the end towards the boss rush. As a result, I'm going to put this one up at B tier, based purely on the fact that it was a very high damaging weapon at level 4, but I still didn't use it that much. I'd consider it fairly situational in the end game specifically. In the earlier game, I didn't use this weapon at all. Next up, we have the cutter. This particular weapon was still at level 1 when I finished the game, and I didn't use it at all. My opinion on this one is still that it's not that useful compared to some of the other ones. So I'm going to put the cutter down here at D tier. Next up, enemy erasers. Easy S tier. These function exactly the same as they do in the other game. Screen clearing nukes. the exception of the glitch that allows you to spam them. You can't do that in Shadow of Naju, which I think was probably a better game balancing mechanic, even though Shadow of Naju is much harder than the regular Guardian Legend game. Still, enemy erasers are one of the best things in the entire game, hands down. So I would put them up here at S tier. Next up, the Fireball. When I finished my playthrough of Shadow of Naju, I only had a level 2 Fireball, and to me this weapon doesn't really shine until it hits level 3 with the larger projectile and damage and high speed. As a result, I didn't really use this one in Shadow of Naju too much. It came in handy against a couple bosses in some areas, but because its upgrade level sort of lagged behind some of the other ones, I'm actually going to put the Fireball down here at B tier. I will put it higher than the bullet shot just because overall I feel like it's a more handy weapon. But had this one been upgradable to level 3 in my playthrough, again, mine stopped at level 2, I would probably put it up at S like I did on the original Guardian Legend. But at level 2, I think it's a little bit lacking, and I didn't really use it that much. Next up, we have the Front Wave. This particular weapon, again, it wasn't until Shadow of Naju Arcade Mode that I realized how useful this weapon is. And for my playthrough of Story Mode, this one didn't get upgraded past level 2. As a result, I didn't really use it that much for the Story Mode, but I will say that it's more effective than I gave it credit for. Had I known that, I would have used it more. I'm going to put this one on B tier after the bullet shot, just because bullet shot ended up being higher level. At level 2, Front Wave is functional in the early part of the game, and I think you get it relatively early on. I don't remember, but that'll be a good place for it. It's a little bit different than the original one. I think I had it lower. I need to make sure and save these. I didn't save my last one, so I'll have to go remake it later. Next up, we have the Grenade. The Grenade in my original playthrough was one of the only weapons that was upgraded to level 3 for Shadow of Naju. That being said, I still didn't use this one that much. Its damage was pretty useful if you're fighting a large or slow-moving target, but given how fast some of the later bosses and stages get, the usefulness for the grenade tapered off even faster than the original Guardian Legend. So I'm going to put it down here at C tier. I'll put it above the shield just because it ended up being higher level. Next up, the laser. Just like in the base NES game for Guardian Legend, you can only use it on the corridor stages in Shadow of Naju. And in my playthrough, the laser was only upgraded to level 2. That being said, I still used it on the majority of the corridor stages after I got it, and it ended up being useful all the way through the final boss. So I would say, based on function, it's at high A tier. If it was upgradable level 3 or 4, it would be an S tier alongside the enemy erasers. But overall, at level 2, I'd say the laser is very solid and is a pretty good mainstay for the scrolling corridor stages. Next up, we have a new weapon that was introduced in Shadow of Naju. This one was not in the original Guardian Legend game and was added, and that's the lightning. There's no wiki for Shadow of Naju, so for the two new weapons, I'm just calling them by the name I used in the playthrough. And the lightning is interesting in that when you use it, it shoots a field of electricity around the Guardian in sort of like a force field. And it does damage to whatever's around it for a couple seconds before it disappears. And this particular weapon I found to be very situational. It wasn't super useful in the corridor stages because you'd have to get right on top of a boss where it's really dangerous. But it did come in handy against some of the mini bosses like the Flame Lord. As a result, I'm going to put the lightning on C tier. Because I found a use for it in certain spots, I'm going to put it ahead of the bullet shield and behind the grenade. The lightning I only got upgraded to level 2 in my original story playthrough for Shadow of Naju. It's an interesting weapon, but from an overall function, I don't think it really holds up in a lot of situations against the other ones. But I do like the concept. Next up is the second new weapon introduced in Shadow of Naju, the mine. This particular one is interesting in that when you use it, it drops a mine that sits on the field and detonates after a certain amount of time. And I think you can put a couple down and then they'll go off over time. The mine I only upgraded to level 2 as well, but overall I didn't find this weapon very useful. I tried against some of the bosses that moved around a lot trying to set traps, but the fact that you have to wait for them to detonate and there's a limit to how many you can place on screen, and I think they're decently expensive from a chip cost perspective, I didn't find this weapon that useful at all. I like the concept. I think the idea of a remote mine is kind of neat, especially if there's a way that you can control when it detonates. But based on the original game, I'm putting this one down here at a D tier with the cutter. Just not that useful given how difficult the later stages are, especially since you get this one after the midpoint in Shadow of Naju. Next up, we have the Repeller. Now this one ended up being very useful and was probably one of my main weapons in Shadow of Naju. This one was the only other level 3 that I got, along with the grenade. And I used this weapon through the end of the game. It was very handy for bosses, it was very handy on the exploration stages and mini-bosses. Based on its damage and function, I'm putting the repellers at S tier after the enemy erasers. Had some of the other weapons been upgradable level 3, I think they'd be up here on the same tier, or I might even move this one down. But that wasn't the case, and I ended up relying on this weapon a lot in my playthrough. So the repellers go up here with S tier. Very handy. Next up is the Saber, the forward sword projectile. This one, sort of like the original Guardian Legend, is somewhat situational. I found a couple cases where it was handy, especially against that beam shooting boss. But overall, I didn't really use this one a ton. I'm going to put this one on low B tier. Sort of in the same vein as the Fireball in that at level 2, which is the max that I was able to get for the Saber in my playthrough. It came in handy in a couple specific instances, but it wasn't a weapon I really used too much. I think if this one was upgradable to max level, it would be higher on the list, or at least higher on this tier. But we're going to put it at the bottom of B tier for the Saber. Next up we have the Seekers. The Seekers, I feel like, came in handy in a lot more specific situations in Shadow of Naju versus the original Guardian Legend. In the original, you could use it on some bosses and it'd be pretty effective, but there were some instances in Shadow of Naju where this weapon absolutely came in handy, and I didn't realize it till arcade mode. The Seekers topped out at level 2, and knowing what I know now about the bosses, some of my runs against those bosses in story mode would have been much easier if I just realized how useful this weapon was. So I'm putting this one on A tier, alongside the laser. It came in pretty clutch in a couple fights, especially against the scrolling bug and the giant alien turret thing. Overall, if this one was upgradable to max level, it'd be an S tier in my opinion. Last but not least, we have the Side Wave. That one's straight D tier. The Side Wave was not a player in Shadow of Naju, just as it was in the original. Its upgrade topped out at level 2, so not the worst as far as upgrade and damage, but I didn't really find a use for it. So many of the other weapons were more effective in higher level or damage. And again, if people know how to use this weapon effectively, it's very possible I just didn't use it correctly, but in both my Guardian Legend story mode and Shadow of Naju story mode playthrough, this one was a non-player. So it's, to me, I'd put it on D tier, but I'm going to move it up above the mine, just because it fires quickly. I'm going to move it above the mine just because it fires quickly and has more damage potential. But that will do it for the base game in Shadow of Naju secondary weapons. Let's see, I'm going to save this. call it Shadow of Naju story. I see. Well, this will save to my account and I'll just download it later in case I want to post it somewhere. But yeah, I think that'll do it for the second installment of the tier lists. Next up, the final one in the series will be a tier ranking based on the Shadow of Naju arcade mode function for the secondary weapons. So I will see you guys in that part.